How's it going, y'all? Good afternoon. Welcome to the Snare Drum Masterclass. This is going to be kind of like a small group today, and like I'm just kind of, starting these master classes throughout the summer, and so hopefully there's going to be a lot more coming up. I'm going to do a timpani one and a mallet one, so I appreciate y'all kind of being my little guinea pigs for this masterclass. Because this group is so small, like I kind of want it to be a little bit more like interactive versus me just lecturing to y'all. And so hopefully, like, because this is such a small group, you guys are getting a lot more out of this versus just me teaching like 100 people and not really getting that one-on-one time. So I'm going to do probably maybe 15, 20, 30 minutes of talking, of just like kind of like introducing some of these concepts that I'm going to talk about today. And then we're going to spend a bulk of time like actually going through the packet, and I'm going to kind of play through and talk through with you guys, and you're going to play with me a bunch too, just to kind of offer some tips of like my approach to snare drum. And then towards the end, we're going to talk about some like real music. We're going to play through some excerpts and like talk about how we can approach them, a little bit about deliberate practice and all that good stuff. So I'll go ahead and get started. Once again, thank you all so much for coming. Can y'all hear me okay, both of you, by the way?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so to start off, my name is Sark Gutierrez. I'm currently the percussion professor over at Our Lady of the Lake University, based in San Antonio, Texas. And the reason why I wanted to put this masterclass together was because from working with a lot of undergrads and a couple of graduate students, there has been a couple of things that I've noticed in their playing that I feel like, given the right tools, like they could be fixed along the way. And so the goal of this masterclass is just to, one, again, talk about my approach to concert snare drum, but also to give y'all tools to work on refining your concert snare drum sound. Because one of the big things I've noticed from just listening to a lot of younger players is that their approach is like really harsh. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about is like, how to approach concert snare drum specifically, because at least here in Texas, a lot of folks are exposed to the marching percussion stuff, which honestly, I'm gonna sit kind of in the middle of the fence here, because I know, like me, like I love marching snare drum. It's been a big part of my life, but honestly, over the past 5 years, I've really forget like a lot of the stuff that I learned during that time, because it really does have an effect on your touch, and especially if you're playing with an orchestra or even like a contemporary snare drum solo or a rudimental solo. There are some things that I feel like we could learn about and watch out for. So one of the things I wanted to talk about first is the different types of snare drums and why we use each. So how many of y'all actually own your own concert snare drum at this point?
I do.
Definitely so.
Okay, so one of the things I wanted to talk about was like selecting your concert snare drum. If you're, this is primarily supposed to be for like high school and middle school kids. They might not own a snare drum at that point, so I'm going to kind of breeze over this since y'all already have your own snares. So my thoughts on this are pretty much like, if you're going to go with your first snare drum that's going to be a little bit more general, I would suggest going for a 14 by 5 or at max 14 by 5.5. The reason is because in my opinion, for a lot of like orchestral rep or even snare drum solos or concert band rep, those are really safe choices because they can accommodate pretty much any genre of like wind band or orchestral music. However, there are some instances where I've seen middle school bands and even high school bands a little bit thicker. Like this is just one example. This is a 15 by 8. I've seen some schools use that as like their default snare drum, which honestly I wouldn't go with that, but that is an option. I would also recommend as a second snare drum to check out some of these piccolo snare drums, like the Pearl Pancake is a really great option. Whenever I was taking lessons with Matt Strauss over at Rice, he's one of the principal percussionists for the Houston Symphony. He makes all of his students buy a pancake snare. And so whenever I was taking lessons with him, he had recommended to have one general snare drum and also invest in a piccolo snare drum for excerpts like Scheherazade or Akiji, stuff like that. I would recommend going with that recommendation because there really isn't much of a demand for something bigger, like some of these bigger field drums. I know that that's an option out there, but if you're looking to kind of expand your snare drum sound and your snare drum library, me and Matt both recommend that you take a look at those Pearl Pancake snares. Also, another great brand is to check out Grover. Grover has worked with Will James of the St. Louis Symphony to create some really awesome piccolo snare drums. So those are both great options. Do y'all have any questions about like, you know, what types of snare drums are out there and maybe why we would use each? Or are we good? If y'all have any questions, just feel free to stop me along the way. But in general, like, especially if you're like a performance major, I would recommend having more than one snare drum, simply because the repertoire that you're going to be playing as a performer will vary. But if you're going to start off with one, this is the one I have. It's a Pearl Philharmonic African Mahogany, I believe, and it's an excellent drum. It's the drum I'm actually playing right here, and you guys can. I'll change my camera so that way you guys can see. I've got a couple different camera angles, that way y'all can see me. I'm gonna pin this video. Hello. Okay, so this is the Pearl Philharmonic African Mahogany. This one's awesome. I totally recommend this as a go-to snare drum, simply because it's like, to me, like some of the brass ones or and aluminum ones, they, especially for solo stuff, like they cut way too much. And so, so I would recommend something that's made out of wood, produces a bit of a warmer tone. Like I'm a drum set player myself, and so I like kind of the warmth that different types of woods produce versus the metal ones. They just cut way too much unless you're going for that. Like if I'm playing with a band that I really need to like crack that snare, then I'll go with that. But as far as a general run, I recommend that one. But let me change back. Great. Okay, so selecting drum heads. I've seen a couple different things across different campuses, like even at colleges and stuff. And I thought I needed to say something about this because I do say it from time to time, and it's important to talk about. So in my opinion, I would recommend going with a relatively thin drum heads for top and bottom. Sometimes I've walked into halls and I've seen thicker heads like coated ambassadors or even coated emperors used on concert snare drums. The reason why I would go against that is because when you buy a thicker drum head, it's not going to produce like a quick enough response, and especially with the articulate stuff that's written for snare drum, we need something that can cut but also has a bit of warmth, but not too much. And so only purchase a thick drum head if you absolutely need it. When you would use a thick drum head is probably on a thicker snare drum like this. I wouldn't recommend a thick drum head for a piccolo drum or really any of these drums except for maybe the thicker ones. So you can look into either a coated ambassador or possibly even a coated emperor for something like that. You could experiment also with really thin heads on these drums, but because you're going to be playing at a bigger dynamic level, you're just going to kind of work your way through that head, and you want something that can kind of be durable for the purposes of that music. Also, there's a difference between like dry sounding drum heads and wetter sounding drum heads. Like you can have like the Evans like Strata, I believe it's called, has like a bunch of holes in it. And it's really, really dry sounding, or you can have something that doesn't have as much coating and produces more resonance. In my opinion, I would always recommend going with something that can breathe and is a bit more resonant because, as he says right here, you can always make a drum head dry, but you can't always make it more resonant. Does that make sense? Like if I start off with kind of like a default resonant head, I can always apply more muffling to it. But if the head is already dry, like I can't really make it more resonant because it's like that already. You know what I mean? And so the times where you would want to use a really dry head would be if you're trying to play something like Shostakovich 10, where it's supposed to be like machine gun type sounds. You know what I mean? But if you want something that's can produce a bit more resonance, which is most of the time kind of what you want is to create resonance on your instrument. You know, whether that's a timpani, whether that's a marimba bar, and even a snare drum. Like that's kind of always our default way to go, is to always go for something that can produce a lot of resonance and characteristic tone. but also having the flexibility to like take away some of that. And so I've got different implements like a neckerchief, so I can use various amounts of it on the snare drum to eat away at the resonance, or you can use good old moon gels. Stuff like that would really help. Some of the drum heads I recommend that you look into are the Remo M5 for the top. That's become a pretty popular and standard head now for auditions. And so I recommend that because it produces an amazing resonant tone, but also has the coded element to it to where it just controls some of those overtones. And this is honestly my favorite batter head. I purchased a new one because I think on these Pearl Philharmonics, it comes with a Renaissance head, which I'm not in love with it, but the Remo M5s are a great place to start. Also, for the resonant head, you can look into a Remo Diplomat Clear. If you're not a big Remo fan, there are other brands like Evans and I'm sure others that make the equivalent of these. So just talk to your music store and figure out what the equivalent would be. Does anyone have any questions on selecting drum heads and like kind of why that's important? Good.
Is there what do you recommend like fiber skins on certain things other than the big thick drums?
To be perfectly honest, like the only time I really used fiber skin heads or on concert bass drum or on drum set if I need it, but for concert snare drum, like I've seen like for example like UTSA, like last time I went over there, they had a fiber skin one on there. I wasn't in love with it, but again, that's like a personal choice. I wouldn't say that's the wrong choice by any means. But that's the thing is that if you own your own concert snare drum, you're already in a fantastic position because you have the luxury of kind of trying out all these different heads. You know what I mean? So go ahead.
They make one that's supposed to imitate it. It's like a synthetic that I've been seeing that they've been putting on like symphonic snare drums and Philharmonic, because I have a Majestic. I bought a Majestic.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of people freak out. Where'd you get that? And I said, well, it comes from the Netherlands. You know, it has the same thing which you put up. And it has, you know, something that's equivalent, different woods, different metals and stuff like that. Don't get me wrong. I'm a Pearl fan my entire life, but the price I got this snare for, I said, nope, I'll take it in a heartbeat.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Honestly, if I were using a fiber skin head, I probably would use it if I was playing something a little bit more like march oriented, something that like wanted to have a little bit more of a thicker sound. But again, there really is no right or wrong. It really just depends on like what you're using it for. But in terms of like I'm speaking in generalities here because like I'm the way I structured this is like if you're gonna own like one snare drum that can kind of cover a lot of ground, here are some things that you can buy to like kind of get a general sound. The reason why I like this thinner Remo M5 is like my general sound is because it has a really quick response and it's got some coating so that way you can eat up some of the overtones. Some of the fiber skin ones are great. I haven't used it enough to form like a really like, you know, concrete opinion on it, but from my experience of using it, like I wouldn't say it's a general head. It's like more for like if you want a specific sound, but that's just my opinion. So great. Okay, so here is a really big thing that a lot of younger folks totally overlook, and that's dialing in the snare mechanism. So one of the things and again, I'm kind of preaching to older folks here, but when I work with a lot of younger folks, like they usually just kind of crank down on it. And so one of the things I recommend, especially if you own your own snare drum, which this is the case for both of you, is to take some time to really understand what each of these wires does and how much you need to adjust it on each. The way I do it, and I'll show you all right now, I do this pretty much every time I take it out of the bag. I start from square one. So I'm going to unshare my screen. Oops, let me do this camera instead so you can see it better. Okay, so check it out. I'm gonna turn it this way so y'all can see. So every time, like because like I play at different schools and stuff. Like for example, I played with like St. Mary's brass ensemble one time, and we had to rehearse at St. Mary's, and I don't know, and I've never used any of their equipment except for those rehearsals. And so
we don't have that much good equipment there. I'm at Mary's myself.
And so when I got there, I was like, okay, I'm playing a concert snare drum I've never seen before, I know nothing about. So I turned it on and played it and was like, okay, this sounds terrible. So let me start over. So basically, I loosen up the butt side strainer, and then also loosen all of these individual strainers. So when I turn it on, you pretty much get 0 snare response. So as you can hear right now, its snare mechanism is engaged, but there's actually no snare response happening. And so what I recommend is, like, before you touch the butt plate one, if you're going to start this from square one, make sure that the butt plate one is not totally loose. Otherwise, these ones won't be engaged. Make it about kind of halfway, if you will, slight bit of tension. Okay, and then individually, it doesn't matter which order, but I'm just going to go left to right. See what it sounds like when you turn each individual strainer all the way up. So if I start with my left one, you can sort of get an idea of like what that individual snare does to the sound. Okay, so then I'm going to turn it all the way off. I'm going to move to the middle one now. Okay, turn that one off. Kind of get an idea of what it sounds like with just that one snare on. And then last but not least, the third one. Yeah, you'll notice that this third one changes the sound a lot. It like kind of warms up the sound. So you can try this on the snare drum that you own, and then dial in like how each of these work together. So you could do the first two now. First two together. That sounds pretty good to me. So I might just add just a pinch of the third one, because this already sounds good. Okay, so it kind of takes you doing this each time if you're playing on a snare drum that you've never played on before. And then of course you can adjust the butt plate one so it kind of pushes up the sound, tightens it up just a bit more. But make sure not to over tighten that, because I make that mistake all the time by over tightening this, and then it chokes the sound a lot. So remember, I think I'm getting ahead of myself here, but hold on. So that took me what, like a minute and a half, 2 minutes? So I recommend doing that each time you approach a snare drum that you've never played before. Okay, so the big thing I was going to say is make sure not to over tighten this, guys. The snare wires should be tight enough to produce an articulate sound, but also, this is the key word here, loose enough to breathe when hitting the drum. When I first got the snare drum, I made the mistake of just kind of cranking everything down, and it kind of really choked off the resonance. And so one of the things, and this happens in the marching world too, is that we get so used to cranking down these Kevlar heads that it doesn't really sound like a snare drum anymore. It sounds like a tabletop. You know what I mean? And that's some of the things you got to be aware of, is like the same concerns in marching as well as concert snare drum, is that at the end of the day, you still want it to sound like a snare drum. You know what I mean? Have it loose enough to where it can kind of breathe and not crank down on it. So be aware of the adjustment mechanisms on the throw off side as well as adjustments on the opposite side. General stuff going on here. So okay, as far as tuning is concerned, most percussionists assume that the snare drum in the percussion studio is already perfect. I was guilty of that too when I was an undergrad. I was like, okay, the snare drum, when I take it out of the studio, I don't know any better. So I assumed that it sounds fine. But little did I know it sounded terrible. You know what I mean? And so at the end of the day, make sure that if you're playing a snare drum that you've never played before, or you're passing this information on to your students, make sure that you remind them that don't be satisfied with how the instrument comes. You know what I mean? Like, see, if you need to adjust it for the repertoire that you're playing, that's okay. And I wish I was kind of given that permission during undergrad, because I was always kind of afraid to mess with the snare drum because I assumed my teacher would get mad if I did that. But really, that's when you're going to learn. You know what I mean? And so even probably not for middle school kids, but at least for high school kids, I would highly recommend that you give that freedom to your students. You know what I mean? That way they can learn like how to use a drum key and like what that's actually for. It's a little weird to me that some band directors like don't allow their kids to like tune the drums if they need to. Granted, the instructor should be there to kind of monitor like how that goes, so that way it can become a learning experience. But I feel like, especially at the college level, you definitely should have the freedom to fix the drum. You know what I mean? Like if the top head is way too loose, maybe tighten it up a bit, because with all those people playing on the studio snare, like that head's just getting beat up over time by so many people, and so it's going to naturally kind of lose that tension. So I would recommend, at least, you know, maybe not every time you bring the snare out, but if you're working on, let's say if you're playing with the orchestra at your college and you're working on certain rep, like feel free to experiment and like tune the snare like for that rep. You know what I mean? Like that's something that I did in undergrad when we were playing Scheherazade. I was really big into excerpts at that time, and so me and my professor, I took our snare drum to our lesson and was like, all right, doc, like I want us to go through this, and I want to find the optimal tuning of like Scheherazade movement 3, like for this drum. Like, can we figure this out together? And that was a great lesson, because if you play Scheherazade 3 on a snare drum that is not like equipped for that, like it's really going to affect the music. So you want to make sure that your instrument is in order. It's at a tuning that's kind of relevant to the music. That will help you play the music successfully. You know what I mean? It's like you can't have the hands and not the drum, or you can't have the drum and not the hands. Like both of those things are kind of equal weight, in my opinion. And so some ways that you can start is by tuning the bottom head to a medium high tension. That's kind of again a general thing. I wouldn't necessarily crank down on it unless you might be using it as like a piccolo snare drum or something like that, where that drum is like designed for that sound. But again, for generalities, the bottom head should be at a medium high tension, and experiment with different intervals for different tones and characteristics. Like I know a lot of orchestral cats will tune the top batter head to a B natural, and then the bottom head to an F, which creates a tritone interval. And so that sort of dissonance kind of adds with the snare sound to create this like really big crunch. Versus if you have two consonant intervals, like a perfect fourth or a perfect fifth, it's not gonna add as much like dissonance to like that crunch snare drum sound, if that sort of makes sense. Because when you listen to a tritone, it sort of has like this crunchy like tonals. It's not tonal, but it's got this like crunchy sound because it's not a consonant interval. So that kind of adds to that distortion of the snare drum. That's kind of getting like brainy and out there, but I will usually I would say my two heads are probably not at a tritone. They're probably at more of like a perfect fourth than anything, just because I like my top head a little bit tighter than medium tension. So just again, an opinion, and experiment with it too. Like if y'all are looking for a great tuning app, I recommend the Tonal Energy app. It's great for band directors. I love it, and it allows me to check the tuning on my drums or timpani, anything like that, and it works great. Okay, sticks. Here's my opinion on sticks. Okay, I used to have like a bunch of pairs, and I would get kind of like option anxiety of like, okay, like which one should I pick for this? But as I've gotten older, I've realized that less is more. You know what I mean? So I think more like broad picture now, to where if I'm gonna have or basically, let me start over. So if it is recommended to have a few pairs of sticks that can accommodate the different playing styles needed for concert snare drum repertoire. This is not the way to look at it, okay? You should not look at it as like, okay, these are my sticks for Kiji, these are my sticks for Scheherazade, these are my sticks for Shostakovich 10. Like, don't look at it that way. Like, because how can I put it? Like, so many variables kind of tie into like, what is the size of the orchestra, or what is the size of the hall? What type of drum do you have access to? You know, all these different types of things kind of account for it. So if you can think more broad, big picture, I recommend having like a pair of small sticks that maybe has some nylon, so you can really hear those doubles if you're playing Scheherazade 3, you know what I mean? Or having a general pair, maybe a large pair. So me on my bandstand right now, I've got a pair of Freers. Freer makes excellent sticks, even though that says Vic Firth on there. I use Tom Freer's General Orchestral snare drum sticks, which basically what you see in the picture is like a copy of that. It's a general stick. And then I also have the Freer Light Orchestral, which is basically a wood tip of what this small one is. And these are basically kind of duplicates of what Freer is doing. And these are great because if I'm trying to play something really low volume dynamically, I want to make sure that I can hear that articulation of what's going on down there. So I'm looking at getting a pair of nylon ones like this because you can really hear that tick a little bit more, especially if you're playing really small stuff like TG or Scheherazade. Like that really brings out the articulation at those small dynamic levels. I mean, it's just a personal opinion too. Like, I don't really think you need 30 pairs of snare drum sticks to be a great snare drummer. It's more about just understanding how your tools work and being able to perform what you need to perform with the tools that you got. Does anyone have any questions on sticks or like why you don't need a million pairs? A lot of the older like orchestral folks that I talk to, they laugh at me because they're like, man, I've been using one pair of sticks my entire career. I don't know why you can't. And so those are just lessons that like, man, maybe I don't need to buy the entire Vic Firth catalog. Maybe I can just use what I got and like kind of master it, you know? And again, this is going to sound like I'm beating a dead horse here, but what's really going to help you is to find what works for you in terms of like what type of like the exact model that you need and how many pairs of what, because I've learned so many things from all these different teachers, but at the end of the day, they all say the same thing. They're like, look, we are two different people. We, you know, genetically like don't have the same hands or the same little deformities or whatever. So you need to find out like what works for you. And so for me, after trying all these different pairs of general sticks, what I've boiled down to is that these feel the best for me. Now, do I make all my students buy these sticks? No, because I want them to kind of go through that process of like figuring out what works for them. But in order for you to figure out what works for you, you need to try out all these different types of sticks. So like every year at PASIC or at TMEA, I would go to the Lone Star percussion table and just try out all the models and like figure out like, okay, this is what this really thick wood feels like when I play big or whatever. And like having access to all those drumsticks will help you figure out like what feels good in your hands and like what you need to work with. Because I've bought in a lot of sticks and sold off a bunch because they didn't feel like quite right with like my hands and like what I need to do with them. Okay, muffling. I put this little picture here just to be funny. So, okay, there are different types of muffling for such as moon gel, handkerchiefs, leather, felt. Most players use too much muffling. Be careful not to choke the resonance of the snare drum. I highly recommend, if y'all get the chance, to go check out your local professional orchestra. And I want you to look at what's on the snare drum there, because most of the time, those big orchestral players, they don't have tons of muffling on there. They really want that resonance to be there to fill up the hall. If they're playing something that requires a lot of articulation, sometimes they even have two snare drums, like one snare drum just to play that articulate stuff, and then the other snare drum for pretty much everything else. So be aware of that. This is what not to do, like all these moon gels on here. So just be careful with that, okay? One is enough. Sometimes the handkerchiefs, I use that like if I need to like really lay down some muffling, if it needs to be really articulate. And of course, the muffling should be used sparingly depending on the repertoire and how much and how the drum responds in the venue or concert hall. Okay, so this is probably the most important part. Okay, so in a nutshell, all the lessons I've taken with orchestral snare drummers, they've pretty much made the same comments to me of like, dude, you're playing way too harsh. Like it just sounds like you're in marching mode. You know what I mean? And so over these past couple of years, what I've really had to do, I really had to force myself to like kind of a bit like just temporarily abandon some of the marching stuff that I've been taught how to do, such as like play the bottom head, like when you're playing on the snare, like it's like you got to play through the drum and like make sure the bottom head is responding. But when it comes to orchestral snare drumming and concert snare drumming, it's kind of the opposite. So like I'm going to show you my drum real quick. And maybe y'all can do this with me. Like, so if y'all have a pair of sticks, we're just going to talk about stroke types really quick and like, kind of how you need to readjust your playing to get the best sound possible. Okay, so check it out. We are used to, as drummers, like kind of playing with intensity, with a lot of velocity and playing the bottom head. What I want you to think of, I want you to think of the snare drum almost like a timpano, where we want to have like a nice legato stroke sound where the stick bounces back up, but it doesn't require a ton of velocity going down. So can y'all just maybe play 4 quarter notes in a row where you focus on kind of playing on the top head versus trying to play the bottom head? So it should look like this. The way I'm thinking about it is I'm thinking about it as literally the weight of the stick is producing all the sound. Like I'm trying not to force any of my own velocity downward. It's the weight that's producing the sound. So that's going to feel really weird because a lot of us are used to like beating the crap out of the drums when we're trying to play really intense. But if you can think of that as like your default concert snare drum sound, it's going to really lighten up your sound a lot. So if I play something like, just listen to me play for a second. I'm trying to play a simple rhythm, but with the absolute lightest touch I can, and just letting the weight of the sticks produce the sound. Can y'all try that on your snare drum real quick? And it's less about the rhythm, it's more about the touch. Can y'all try that? I'll give you 10 seconds. Okay, so if you notice, like, that is the way I'm kind of approaching this is like that is our default sound, this nice resonant light sound. However, there's a switch that I can pull. It's like that switch is increasing the intensity and increasing the velocity. So if there's a part in the music where I need that amount of drive and I really need to push the weight of the sound, that's when I can use a little bit more of that downwards velocity to produce a darker sound. So I'm going to play version A and version B. See if you can hear a difference. Here's A. Here's B. So with letter B, I'm pushing more velocity down into the head to play a little bit more authoritatively, like as if I'm trying to lead the orchestra. You know what I mean? So having that flexibility to like have that default general light sound, but then also turn the switch and add that intensity, that is really, really important because I feel like a lot of younger students, their default is that really intense dark sound. Almost kind of like a German grip, like dark sound versus that French kind of light sound. Can you try that for a second? Just experiment with those, with the different types of intensity and lightness of sound and darkness of sound. It's more about the touch. Can you try that? I'll give you 10 seconds.
Oh, I gotta practice that. I don't have the snare drum set up. You just gotta.
Or if you just want to try it on your leg, you can try that too. It's okay.
I had an instructor a long time ago, back in my times, like the 90s. He would almost tell us to treat it like the timpani.
Yeah, exactly. That's so true.
Pull out the sound. Just pull out the sound and let the weight of the stick, and you just force it back up.
And here's the reason why that's important. Okay, like I want you to think
I
about.
hear that, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No,
I didn't mean to.
that's okay. Continue what you were saying.
No, I'm just saying because I mean, when I started trying to use that, I could feel and hear the difference because it kind of changes my style of playing because I was too busy trying to force the stick. My wrists were getting too tired, from pushing that stick too hard, like marching band. What do we do in marching band? We're too busy slamming the heck out of that head, you know.
Yeah,
But
for real. And some of the people I've studied with, like the orchestral folks, a lot of them say their default technique is like the timpani technique. You know what I mean? And so that kind of should paint like a clearer picture of like the angle that I'm coming from is like the way I play the timpani or the timpano is kind of how the same way I would play like a marimba bar, where like I want to have the marimba bar produce a nice resonant sound. And what's going to help is if my stroke type produces that resonant sound too. So again, it's kind of different than what a lot of us have been taught growing up, because I was kind of taught, okay, if you're going to play snare drum, like you got to lead the band and be aggressive, you know? But over time, I realized that if you do that, it's just going to blow the entire ensemble away. Like, and then everyone's going to be competing for loudness, you know? And so that's just something to be aware of. And just to kind of elaborate on that point, like think about it from like a clarinetist standpoint or a flute standpoint. Their default sound is like this like beautiful, full, kind of light sounding block of sound versus trying to play with a lot of edge. You know what I mean?
of course, that's why they put them in the front.
Yeah. So I want you to think of that like for snare drum, where our default sound should be kind of this like light legato airy sound without all that bite and edge. Like we can have the bite and edge if we need to, but that shouldn't be our default sound. Does that sort of make sense?
Yes.
Okay, great. And just kind of listen to me play for a second. Like notice the lightness and sound that I have, and then I'll play some aggressive stuff in a second. But just listen to the lightness real quick. To me that sounds really like pleasing to listen to, you know what I mean? Because it's like it has this nice light airy sound quality, and it makes me think like, oh, it has more musical characteristics. Okay. And this is, and I'm telling y'all from experience, like from speaking to some of my colleagues, um they are afraid to listen to snare drum solos, and I asked them why. And they're like, well, because it just is so loud and so abrasive. And so hearing that from like a bassoon professor and a trumpet professor is like, that hurts my feelings, because it's like, man, we've got a lot of work to do to like convince these other instrumentalists that this instrument can be musical too. You know what I mean? And so the way I want you to think about it is like, imagine the people on your jury or committee or whatever, none of them are percussionists. Like 9 times out of 10 that's the case. But like, if like my goal is to always convince that flute player or that saxophone player that like there's a melodic idea happening here, and it's something that it's like you gotta, how can I put it, you gotta over exaggerate it so it's as musical as possible. And one of the first ways you can do that is by lightening up your overall approach to the instrument. Versus something heavier, like that just has way too much bite and it's way too aggressive. So that's something that you can kind of experiment with, like as you're working on your touch for concert snare drum. And that's kind of like my big preaching point is like, you got to kind of treat all the instruments as like resonating instruments. You know what I mean? But let me finish this up so that way we can get to the packet, because I've been talking for a while. Okay, last but not least. Okay, many young snare drummers play too aggressively. The snare drum is easily one of the loudest instruments in the band or orchestra. There is, oh, hold on. Let me share my screen so y'all can see, sorry. Okay, so many young snare drummers play too aggressively. The snare drum is easily one of the loudest instruments in the band or orchestra. There is no need to overpower. The key is mastering playing at all volume dynamic levels. Um, I was guilty of this, where again, being from the marching world, like my general volume was always like forte or fortissimo, and you're just gonna blow the whole band away. So I'm sure all of y'all at one point have studied in lessons like playing at really small dynamic levels. And one of the things I learned again from Matt Strauss was that should be something you're doing every day, which is why I made this little warm up routine packet. So that way I could give my students like, okay, if you're gonna have a 10-minute warm up routine, don't guess around like what you should be doing. Like there's kind of like basic things that you need to be doing every day, such as long tones for like wind instruments or brass instruments. They're not practicing like crazy weird stuff on a daily basis. It's like usually the same routine of like long tones, Remington, that kind of stuff. And so we should follow that same approach too. Like, what are the most common what are the most common rudiments and musical phrases that get asked in music all the time? And like that should be like our foundation of like what to actually practice. So generally, focus on playing with a lighter style that has the ability to intensify to more aggressive playing if need be. Okay, and last but not least, okay, how to use this packet. So if y'all have the packet, we're gonna look at that now. Feel free to start and end with any of these exercises. This is not necessarily meant to be played in order. More importantly, use this as a launching pad to create your own exercises. Only you know what you need to warm up with. A good warm up should allow you to play the music that you need to play, assuming you have worked on it and can play it slowly. At the end of the warm up, play through commonly asked rudiments, rhythms, and phrases. Order and repetition depends on the person and what they are warming up for. No two people should have the exact same routine. Each individual person has different strengths and weaknesses to work on. Okay. I know I kind of talked on for a while, but does anyone have questions of like sort of the approach to like where I'm coming from and like why I think we should have a lighter touch on concert snare drum? It's kind of the point of the masterclass here.
No, Joe Capello has me on something similar to this that I'm supposed to be practicing all the time.
Yeah,
So
and this, you know,
I'm guilty. I don't. I've been kind of slacking, but I mean, at my age, trying to come back because of my passion, I
yeah,
started teaching my son, and now I said, you know what, I want to go back and get my degree and start teaching the stuff that I used to love to do when I was a kid.
yeah, and especially down here in Texas, like man, a lot of our instructors just teach our kids to just like have this super aggressive sound that like would send an orchestra like running. They'd be like running away from you because you're just gonna blow them all away, you know. So it's like you want to basically the moral of the story is have your playing be inviting to listen to. You know what I mean? And it's not really inviting to listen to if like you're just blowing me away. You know, like it's got to be like, oh, that sounds so musical. I didn't think a snare drum could be pleasant to listen to. You know, so that's just stuff to think about. But